Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. I had always loved the woods. They had a kind of peace that I couldn't get anywhere else. Some people don't like being alone out there, but I always did. The quiet, the long trails, the way the sun cut through the trees and painted the forest floor in patches of gold. Those were the things I craved. A couple of years ago, I decided to spend a few days hiking alone in Tennessee. I had the gear, I had the experience, and I wanted the solitude. Looking back now, I still remember that trip clear as day, but not for the peace. I remember it for the sound that froze me in my tracks and sent me out of the forest faster than I thought possible. That morning started out like every other good hike. I parked at the trailhead early, right after sunrise, when the air was still cold enough to make me pull my jacket tighter. There were no other cars there, which meant I'd probably have the trail to myself for a good part of the day. I strapped on my pack, made sure the straps were tight, and started moving. The weight of the pack shifted on my shoulders, the straps digging in, but it felt good, solid, like I had everything I needed to get by if I had to. I liked that feeling. The trail wound through the trees, climbing slowly, and I fell into a rhythm right away. My boots crunched on the dirt and rocks. I let my trekking poles click against the ground in an easy beat. I wanted to make some noise, not for myself, but for whatever else might be in those woods. Tennessee is black bear country, and bears don't like being surprised. I'd read enough and heard enough from locals to know that startling one was about the worst mistake you could make. So I made sure they could hear me long before I'd ever see them. The woods smelled damp, earthy, that heavy smell you get when it rained the night before, and the ground was still holding onto the water. The leaves were dripping in places where the sun hadn't yet reached, and every now and then, I'd brush past a bush and get a spray of cold droplets across my arm. Birds were up already, singing in every direction. I caught sight of a doe once, delicate legs moving quick as it bolted into the undergrowth. For a while, that was the biggest thing I saw. Just birds, trees, and the endless trail winding ahead of me. My breathing was steady but heavy as I worked my way higher up the mountain. I remember thinking that it was one of the most peaceful hikes I'd been on in a long time. But that peace didn't last. It happened a little before noon. I'd stopped at a switchback, standing still with my hands on my knees, catching my breath. My shirt stuck to my back and sweat was dripping down my forehead. I took a swig from my water bottle, let the cold liquid wash down my throat, and that was when I heard it. At first, I thought it was a woman. It sounded exactly like a woman screaming. It wasn't words, not like someone calling for help, but a long, high, rising scream that broke and fell in waves before cutting off. The sound went through me like a blade of ice. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either, loud enough to carry through the trees clear as day. My hand froze halfway to putting the cap back on my water bottle. For a second, I didn't even breathe. My entire body locked up. I don't know how long I stood there before it came again. The same sound, that same awful scream. It rose up sharp and high, then dropped into something lower, then rose again before fading off. I felt my chest tighten, my heart slamming against my ribs. Every part of me was screaming to run, but I couldn't make my legs move. It sounded human, but not human at the same time. That's what made it so much worse. It was close enough to make my brain think it was a person, but wrong enough that I knew it wasn't. I forced myself to move, slowly, carefully. I turned around on the trail and started walking back the way I came. My hands gripped my poles tight, my pack shifting on my back as I moved. I didn't run. I didn't want to make more noise than I already was. Just walked, quick but quiet, trying to keep my breathing under control. Every step, I was listening for it, for another scream, for something crashing through the trees, for anything. And all the while, my brain kept telling me the same thing. You are not supposed to be here right now. The trail felt twice as long on the way back. Every twist and turn felt unfamiliar, like I had somehow gotten myself lost even though I hadn't. The air felt heavy in my chest. My legs ached, but I kept pushing. I don't know how long I walked before the screams started to fade. I didn't hear them again, but the silence that followed wasn't better. It was worse. It was the kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes your breath sound too loud, too heavy. My skin prickled with every step, and the back of my neck felt raw, like something was watching me. After what felt like forever, I reached the old logging road I'd noticed earlier in the day. It wasn't part of the marked trail, but I knew it cut back in the general direction of where I'd parked. It was wider, more open, with less brush pressing in from the sides. It felt safer, though safe was a word that didn't mean much in that moment. I turned onto it and started trudging down. My boots sank into the soft dirt, the air thicker and warmer now as I descended. I never once let myself stop moving. The farther I went, the less I felt like I could breathe. My chest was tight, my throat dry even though I kept taking sips of water. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees. Shadows twisted between the trunks, and every time a bird fluttered out of a bush, I nearly jumped out of my skin. The forest no longer felt like a place I loved. It felt hostile, alien, like it wanted me out. When I finally reached my car, I didn't waste a second. I threw my pack in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, and slammed the doors shut. My hands were shaking as I shoved the key into the ignition. Only when the engine turned over and I pulled out of the lot did I let myself exhale. I drove out of those woods without looking back, the sound of that scream still echoing in my skull. For weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I'd be lying in bed at night, and I'd hear it again in my head, that high, awful wail rising and falling in the silence of the forest. It made me wonder if I'd really heard it at all, or if maybe I'd been dehydrated, maybe just hallucinating like I'd told myself at first. But deep down, I knew it had been real. Too real. Months later, I was talking with my uncle about the trip. He's lived in the mountains his whole life. Hunts, fishes, hikes. He knows more about the woods than anyone else I know. I told him what I heard, careful with my words, not wanting to sound crazy. When I finished, he just laughed. He pulled up a video on his phone and handed it to me. The sound that came out of the speakers made my blood run cold all over again. It was the exact sound I had heard that day in the woods. Not similar, not close. The exact same scream. It wasn't a woman. It wasn't a banshee. It was a mountain lion in heat calling for a mate. I sat there listening to it, my skin crawling, remembering the way it had cut through the forest and locked me in place. That was what I had heard. A predator. Not a ghost, not a spirit, but something real, something dangerous. And I had been out there alone, miles from anyone, carrying nothing but a pack and a couple of trekking poles. Even knowing what it was doesn't make it less terrifying. If anything, it makes it worse. A mountain lion is far more dangerous than any ghost story. I was lucky it hadn't come closer. Lucky it hadn't decided I was worth following. Lucky that all I heard was its call and not the sound of it moving through the brush after me. Every time I think back to that day, I realize just how close I might have been to becoming a story myself. Another hiker who vanished in the mountains without a trace. And that, I think, is why people in Appalachia keep telling stories of the banshee. When you're in those woods alone and you hear that scream, your mind doesn't jump to a mountain lion. It jumps to something older, something darker, something you can't explain. Because the truth is, the scream of a mountain lion is close enough to human that it twists your brain, makes you doubt what you're hearing. It crawls under your skin and sticks there. The people who came before me didn't have YouTube videos or recordings to explain it away. They had their ears, their fear, and the way the sound carried through the night. And fear is more powerful than any explanation. I'll never forget that day. I'll never forget the way the forest turned on me in an instant. What I heard was no myth. It was no banshee. It was a predator, alive and real and far too close for comfort. I left that mountain with a story burned into me. And even though I now know what it was, I can still hear it sometimes in my dreams. That scream, that terrible rising and falling scream. And every time I wake up with my heart pounding, The memory sharp as if it just happened again. That's the truth of it. Not a ghost, not a spirit, just nature reminding me that I was out of my element. And nature, out there in the backwoods of Tennessee, doesn't care about your peace or your solitude. It has its own rules and it's up to you to respect them. I did the right thing by leaving that day, and I'll always be glad I did. 'Cause out there, when you hear something like that, you don't get brave. You don't go looking. You get out, and I did. I remember that morning clearly. My wife and I had decided to spend the day hiking in Shenandoah National Park. We had been there a couple of times before, but always stuck to the more popular trails, the ones people recommended in guidebooks. This time, though, we wanted to explore a little more. We got up early, packed our backpacks with water, sandwiches, some fruit, and a few snacks, and made sure we had the basics: map, compass, a flashlight, and our phones. The weather was cool, a crispness in the air that made the start of the hike feel refreshing. The kind of morning where the sunlight hasn't fully warmed the ground yet. So you get that smell of damp leaves and soil rising with every step. The trail started out easy, wide enough for the two of us to walk side by side. We weren't rushing, just enjoying being outside together. The forest around us was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves when a bird darted through the branches, or when a squirrel jumped from one tree to another. The further we went, the more it felt like the rest of the world faded away. It was just us and the woods. That's one of the things I love most about hiking. You start to feel like you're part of the place, not just passing through it. After about an hour, maybe a little more, we came to a fork in the trail. The main path continued straight, well-trodden, with signs pointing toward a waterfall overlook a few miles ahead. But there was another trail branching off to the right, narrower, less obvious, almost like it didn't get as much foot traffic. We stopped for a moment, checking the map. It showed the side trail as a loop that eventually connected back to the main one. It was only about a mile down and then back again, so we figured we had plenty of time. It was still early in the day and we weren't in a hurry. We thought it would be nice to see something different, maybe a quieter part of the forest. So we took the side trail. Right away, it felt different. The trees seemed closer together, the path a little rougher underfoot. There were roots snaking across the ground, and fallen branches here and there that we had to step over. Wasn't difficult, just less maintained. The kind of path that made you feel like you were really exploring, not just following where everyone else had already gone. I liked that. My wife walked just ahead of me, the sun catching her hair every now and then through the breaks in the canopy. We didn't talk much, just kept moving, listening to the sounds of the woods. The trail wound gently downward, deeper into the forest. I noticed the temperature dropping a little the further we went. The air felt cooler, damper, carrying the earthy smell of moss and wet soil. My boots crunched softly on the gravel and leaves, and every so often I'd hear the snap of a twig when I didn't place my step carefully enough. We passed through sections where the trees grew so thick the light barely filtered through, and then suddenly the path would open up into a small clearing where sunlight poured down like a spotlight. It was beautiful in that quiet, untouched way you only find deep in the woods. We had gone just over a mile, maybe a little more, when we noticed something unusual up ahead. At first it was faint, like background noise you don't pay attention to right away. Voices, laughter, not the kind of laughter you'd expect from hikers. It wasn't relaxed or casual. It had a sharpness to it, an edge. I slowed down, motioned for my wife to stop. We both listened. The sound was coming from just ahead, down the curve of the trail. I don't know what I expected. Maybe another group of hikers, though it seemed strange to hear people laughing like that out here, where most folks usually kept quiet to enjoy the peace. We kept walking slower now, more careful with our steps. As we got closer, the voices became clearer. There were several of them, both men and women. And then, through the trees, I caught sight of movement. It took me a second to make sense of what I was seeing. There was a group of people, maybe 6 or 7 of them, gathered in a small clearing just off the trail. Two of them were holding cameras, cheap-looking like camcorders or maybe phones on tripods. A couple of others were standing around, half-dressed. And then there were two in the middle, completely naked, doing things that made my stomach turn as soon as I realized what it was. They were filming some sort of amateur porno. And not just any porno. What I saw made me freeze. It was a golden shower scene. I felt my throat tighten, my stomach twist. The reality of it hit hard, sudden and ugly. Out here, in the middle of the woods, surrounded by trees and silence, stumbling into that, it felt wrong in a way I can't fully explain. I looked at my wife. Her face was pale, eyes wide. We hadn't expected anything like this, and now we were standing there, caught between turning back and trying not to draw attention, or quietly slipping past and hoping no one noticed us. But the problem was, they had noticed. One of the men with a camera turned his head and saw us. For a second he just stared, like he couldn't believe we were really there. Then he nudged the guy next to him. Slowly, the whole group started turning toward us. That was the moment I felt fear prick the back of my neck. The laughter stopped. The clearing went quiet except for the buzzing of flies in the heat. Their expressions weren't embarrassed, not like you'd expect if someone got caught doing something they shouldn't. Instead, it was flat, unreadable. A couple of them smirked. One of the men, tall, with a shaved head, just stood there staring at us, his arms crossed. The silence stretched until it felt like the air itself was pressing down on my chest. I forced myself to take a step back, tugging at my wife's arm. We didn't say anything, just turned and started walking back the way we came. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. Every instinct told me not to run, not to show panic, but to move steadily, calmly, like nothing was wrong. The problem was I could hear them behind us. Footsteps. At first just one or two, then more. Leaves crunching, twigs snapping. They weren't trying to hide the fact they were following. We picked up the pace. The trail seemed longer on the way back, every curve dragging out, every rise in the ground making my legs ache. My wife kept looking over her shoulder, her face tight with fear. I wanted to tell her not to just keep moving, but I was too focused on listening. The footsteps stayed with us, sometimes closer, sometimes further back, but always there. At one point, I risked a glance behind. I saw three of them, walking in a loose line down the trail, watching us. No cameras now, just empty hands swinging at their sides. I tried to think. We were at least a mile from the main trail. If we could make it back there, maybe we'd run into other hikers. Or at the very least, we'd be closer to safety. But the trail felt endless. My mouth was dry, my shirt sticking to my back with sweat. The forest that had seemed peaceful earlier now felt oppressive. Every shadow hiding something, every sound magnified. I kept imagining what would happen if they caught up to us, if they cornered us out here with no one around. That thought alone was enough to push me forward. At some point, the footsteps behind us faded. I didn't trust it. I kept expecting them to reappear, to step out from behind the trees ahead of us. My nerves were stretched so thin that every crack of a branch made me flinch. We didn't slow down until we saw the fork in the trail again, the main path just ahead. Relief washed over me, but it was tangled with dread. I kept looking back, half expecting them to come bursting out of the trees. We didn't see them again. By the time we made it back to the main trail, the only sounds were the wind moving through the branches and the distant call of a bird. We didn't stop. We kept moving faster now, almost jogging. Every hiker we passed after that, I wanted to warn them, tell them to stay away from that side trail, but the words stuck in my throat. I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't want to relive it by describing what we'd seen. So we just kept going until we finally made it back to the trailhead, back to the parking lot, back to the car. Only when the doors were shut and locked did I feel like I could breathe again. My wife sat in the passenger seat staring out the window, her hands shaking in her lap. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady my own hands. We didn't say anything for a long time. The silence between us was heavy, loaded with everything we didn't want to put into words. The whole drive out of the park, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see them behind us somehow. Even now, thinking back, I can't fully explain the fear of that day. It wasn't just what we saw. It was the way they looked at us, the way they followed without saying a word, without rushing, like they had all the time in the world. Like they knew there was no one else around who could help us. We escaped because we kept moving, because we didn't give them a chance to close the distance. But the feeling of being hunted, of being marked out in the middle of the woods, has never left me. Whenever I think about hiking now, that image flashes in my mind. The clearing, the cameras, the sudden silence when they saw us, and the sound of their footsteps following us back through the forest. We never took the side trails again. I was in college when this happened, and I still think about it sometimes when I'm driving late at night. It was one of those nights where nobody wanted to sit in the dorm and just talk. We were restless. It was a weeknight, but none of us had early classes, and I had borrowed my dad's car for the week because he didn't need it. That meant we weren't stuck walking around campus or hanging out in the same spots we always did. We could go somewhere. That was the whole idea that started it. Go somewhere new, somewhere we hadn't been. It was already after midnight when someone suggested Fondé Mountain. None of us had ever been on that road before. It was in southeastern Kentucky, kind of out of the way, but we figured it wouldn't matter since we had nothing better to do. It felt like the perfect kind of late-night adventure. Drive a road nobody had ever been down, see what it was like, and maybe come back with a funny story. By the time we actually got on the road leading up the mountain, it was close to 3 a.m. The car was running fine and the night air outside was cool. The mountain road twisted back and forth, narrow in some places with trees pressing in on either side. My headlights caught branches, road signs, and every now and then the reflective glint of an animal's eyes deep in the brush. The higher we went, the quieter it got. No traffic, no houses, nothing. Just the sound of the engine and the crunch of gravel when we hit patches of rough road. When we finally reached the top and started heading down the other side, the mood inside the car shifted. It was still quiet outside, but the air felt heavier somehow. The woods looked darker, and the beams from my headlights didn't seem to reach very far. That was when we saw it. At first, it just looked like a big cat running alongside the road, but still inside the woods. It was huge. Bigger than any dog I'd ever seen, more like the size of a mountain lion. My first thought was that it had to be one, but something didn't sit right about it. As I glanced at it while driving, I realized it wasn't running on 4 legs. It was upright, moving through the trees on 2 feet. It was fast, faster than seemed possible for something shaped like that, and it didn't move like a person. Its stride was wrong, off balance, but somehow strong enough to keep up with the car for a short stretch before fading back into the trees. My chest felt tight, and I pressed the gas harder. No one in the car spoke, but I could feel everyone staring out their windows, trying to make sense of what they had just seen. I didn't want to slow down. I didn't even want to glance back in the mirrors. I just kept driving, watching the dark road bend down toward the valley. The plan was to keep going until we hit Clairfield, Tennessee. That was the next town over. We figured once we got there, we could at least relax a little. But when we reached the city limit sign, something about the town was off from the start. There were 2 streetlights at the edge of town, one on each side of the road. I'd seen plenty of small towns with setups like that before, but these lights didn't look right. They were swaying back and forth, not like they were about to fall, but like they were switching places with each other, crossing back and forth over the road. The glow of the bulbs seemed to float through the air in a way that didn't make any sense. I slowed down for a second, just enough to take it in, but the uneasiness from earlier was already pushing me to keep going. My hands were sweating on the wheel. I accelerated again, trying to focus only on the road in front of me. Then we passed through the middle of town. The streets were nearly empty. No cars parked along the sides, no people out walking. The houses and shops looked worn down, the kind of place where you could tell the population had been shrinking for years. But in the middle of the main street, just barely in the spill of my headlights, I saw 2 men, They were standing behind a van with its back doors open. One of them was holding a large dark bag, heavy-looking like it was filled with something solid. The other man reached out to grab the other end, and together they lifted it into the van. I can't say with certainty what was inside, but the shape, the way it sagged in the middle, and the way they handled it, it looked exactly like a body bag. My stomach dropped. I didn't let the car slow down. I floored it and blew past them. Neither man looked up. They didn't shout. They didn't even flinch. It was like they either didn't notice us or didn't care. By then I just wanted out. I wanted off that mountain, out of that town, away from whatever was happening. I didn't care about the adventure anymore. I only cared about putting miles between me and Clairfield. We drove until we found the first gas station that still had its lights on. It was miles away, some tiny place on the side of the highway. But I pulled in hard and parked at the first open pump. The inside smelled like old coffee and cigarettes. A tired-looking man sat behind the counter watching a small TV. I didn't tell him what we had seen. I didn't even try to explain, just asked for directions back another way. Any way that didn't involve going over Fonday Mountain again. He gave me the directions without question and we left. The drive back was silent. Nobody said much of anything until we were almost to campus. Even then, nobody could put it into words. We were all stone sober. None of us had been drinking or doing anything else. And while it was late, staying up until 3 a.m. wasn't unusual for us. It wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't drunken imagination. We saw what we saw. To this day, I don't know how to explain any of it. Maybe the thing in the woods really was some animal, even though it ran on 2 legs. Maybe there was some logical reason for those lights in Clairfield to move the way they did. And maybe those men were just hauling something innocent that happened to look like a body bag. That's what I try to tell myself when I think back on it, but I can't make myself believe it. The memory sits in the back of my mind, heavy and sharp, and no matter how much time passes, I can still picture it in perfect detail. The stride of that thing in the woods, the glow of those lights drifting across the road, and the sight of that bag sliding into the back of a van. We left that night without answers, and I don't think I'll ever get them. All I know for certain is that I've never once thought about going back over Fonday Mountain again. I was camping near Rosman, North Carolina with a few friends. We had found a quiet spot tucked back off a gravel road, not too far from a stream. The place wasn't official or anything, but it had a flat stretch of ground that was good enough for tents, and it felt private. We had 2 bigger tents set up for the group, but I had brought along my own little one-man tent because I liked having my own space when sleeping outdoors. The others teased me a bit, but I didn't mind. My tent was simple, just enough room for me to crawl in, lay out my bedroll, and keep my bag at the side. We spent the evening cooking some food over the fire, sitting around, and talking until late. The night got dark quick, with the kind of deep mountain darkness that makes you feel cut off from the rest of the world. I remember looking up through the trees and seeing patches of stars when the smoke shifted. By the time I crawled into my tent, it was probably close to midnight. I slid into my bedroll with my pillow tucked under my head and my water bottle wedged in next to me, the same way I always did when camping. I felt tired but comfortable, and I fell asleep without much trouble. At some point in the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't realize what was wrong. I was half asleep, groggy with the cold night air around me. I could feel the fabric of my bedroll and the pillow under my head. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized I wasn't inside my tent. I was outside, lying in the open. The sky above me was just a blank sheet of black. No stars, no firelight, no tent walls. It took me a second to even process it. I blinked a few times, rubbed my face, and tried to figure out what I was looking at. My first thought was that I must have left the tent open or rolled halfway out of it somehow. But when I sat up a little and looked around, there was nothing close by. No glow from the campfire, no outline of tents, nothing. The ground under me was damp and uneven. It wasn't the flat spot where we had set up camp. My bedroll was there with me, zipped up around my body. My pillow was still tucked under my head. My water bottle was wedged in with me too, like I had carried the whole setup down here in my sleep. That's when I felt my chest tighten. I didn't have any history of sleepwalking. I couldn't even imagine how I would have dragged myself, still inside the bedroll, away from my tent without waking up. My heart started beating harder, but the woods were so still that even my breathing felt loud. I sat there for a while, not sure what to do. I didn't want to call out too loudly because it was the middle of the night, and sound carried weird in the mountains. I didn't want to wake everyone up just because I was confused. So I tried speaking at a normal tone, calling out to my friends. My voice sounded small, swallowed up by the dark. No one answered. I thought about getting up and trying to find my way back, but it was pitch black. I didn't know what direction camp was in, and the last thing I wanted was to wander farther off. So I just stayed where I was, zipped up in the bedroll, trying to stay calm. I drifted in and out of a shallow, uneasy sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I would wake up in another spot, even farther from camp. I kept opening my eyes to check, but I was always in the same place on the damp ground with trees around me. It was cold and uncomfortable, and I couldn't stop thinking about how I had gotten there in the first place. The hours stretched on like that, with me caught between dozing off and startling awake again. When the first light started to creep through the trees, I finally saw where I was. The hill where we had set up camp was above me. Somehow I had ended up all the way at the bottom. I felt stiff as I sat up and shook myself free from the bedroll. My clothes were a little damp, and the side of my bedroll had collected bits of dirt and leaves. I picked up my pillow and water bottle and started trudging back up the hill. The climb wasn't steep, but I was tired, and the whole way up I kept trying to picture what must have happened during the night. None of it made sense. By the time I got back to camp, the fire was cold, and the tents were quiet. Everyone else was still asleep. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it right away, so I set my stuff aside and sat there for a bit. But when I realized one of my friends wasn't in their tent, I got uneasy again. I woke up the others and we all looked around. The missing friend turned up not long after, coming from down the same hill. He looked as thrown off as I had felt. Turned out the exact same thing had happened to him. He had woken up outside in his bedroll with a couple of his things, and realized at dawn that he was at the bottom of the hill. Neither of us had ever had any kind of sleepwalking problem. None of our friends admitted to messing with us, and honestly, it would have been too much effort for a prank. Carrying us, bedroll and all, without waking us, it just didn't add up. We sat there that morning trying to piece it together, but there was no clear explanation. All I knew was that I felt unsettled. I kept glancing down the hill while we packed up, like I was expecting something else to happen. We finished out the trip without anything strange happening again, but I never shook off that feeling. Waking up outside, away from camp with no memory of how I got there was bad enough. Finding out the same thing happened to someone else made it worse. We couldn't write it off as just a weird dream. It left me uneasy in a way I still don't have words for. The only comfort was that we were both unharmed, just tired and confused. But the fact that neither of us could explain it still sticks with me. It made the woods feel different, less like a quiet escape, and more like a place that could take control of you without warning. When I think back to it, the clearest memory I have isn't the confusion of waking up outside. It's the way the morning light hit the slope of that hill as I walked back up, carrying my pillow under one arm. The hill wasn't steep, but it looked higher than it should have, like I had been farther away from camp than I wanted to admit. The distance made it all sink in. However I ended up down there, it hadn't been just a step or two outside my tent. It was far enough that I should have woken up along the way. And that's the part I can't forget. I still wake up some nights with my heart pounding like it did that night. A tight, stupid animal panic that feels like it could bring me right back into the back seat of that car. I remember the smell of cheap beer and cigarette smoke in the bar, the sticky counter under my palms, the dull throb behind my eyes from too much whiskey. I remember laughing with people I barely knew, pretending I was 10 times more confident than I felt, trying to blend in with a place that tasted like old neon and fried food. I remember the small-town feeling of it all, how every surface seemed worn in the same way, like the whole place had been used up slowly, politely, for decades. I grew up in New Jersey. College sent me west to West Virginia, to a town that felt like a map folded in on itself. That weekend, a few people I knew kind of well invited me and my roommate to their family home in Weirton. Felt like one of those college things where you go because it's offered, and because it will be a story later. The plan was simple: leave campus, drive the hour and a half, hang out at someone's house, go to a local bar, be home safe the next day. Simple. Like everything that breaks open later. The bar was a hole in the wall, the kind of place with a jukebox stuck on the same decade, and a pool table that leaned towards the corner, like it had given up trying to be flat. The people there had hands that belonged to farmers and welders, faces that had seen things, and learned to keep their mouths shut about most of them. We all drank and got louder. The music was something to lean into, a steady background heartbeat that made everything move faster than it should have. I remember thinking at the time that the drunker I felt, the warmer and smaller the world became, and that felt good in a stupid, childish way. That illusion ended as soon as we left. When it was time to go, the world was dark outside, the kind of dark that makes streetlights look lonely and stupid. The driver, the one who had volunteered to be the designated driver, walked out with a swagger that didn't match how he actually felt. He smelled like the bar, strong, bitter, and familiar. People joked that he was fine, clapped him on the back. I remember standing in the parking lot watching him fumble with his keys, a loose little grin on his face that shouldn't have been trusted. I remember thinking, uncomfortably, that his speech slurred even in the small bursts as he said things to people. No one stopped him. That was the part that keeps me awake. The way everyone else decided it was okay. We piled into a car that had no business holding that many people and that much noise. The windows were fogged with breath and laughter. I took the middle seat in the back because that's where you end up when no one is trying to be comfortable. I felt the vinyl seat stick to the back of my thighs. I felt the press of bodies on either side of me, and tried to make jokes in my head to keep myself from noticing how thin the driver's hands looked when they clutched the steering wheel. I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself out loud that I would be fine. Those are the lies that feel reasonable until they don't. He started driving fast right away. The car pulled out into the black of the country road like something trying to escape. The road was narrow, lined in trees so close together the headlights only made shallow white tunnels for a few seconds at a time. There were no sidewalks, no houses with porch lights, no other cars to measure against. The speedometer probably read something I did not want to know. Every turn bent the car in ways that made my stomach drop, and I realized I had no idea where I was. The town names on the signs were unfamiliar. The world outside the windows was a smear of dark, and the beams from the headlights carving brief, frightened shapes into it. The car lurched. I grabbed the seam between the seats without thinking. My fingers left damp marks. The driver's laughter to the front seat felt wrong. It was too high, too eager, like someone trying to convince themselves they were okay. The road leaned into curves the way a drunk person leans into a bar. One turn came up too fast. The driver turned the wheel with a force that made the whole car tilt, and every body in the back slid like loose coins. My head hit the rear window for a moment, and the world fizzed with sharp light and the sting of my scalp against glass. I caught a glimpse of the sky, a black so deep it felt like a bruise pressing into my eyes. There was a stretch of road that seemed endless, a ribbon cutting through trees and hills that rose and dipped, like the slow waves of a sad sea. He pushed the car into those stretches like a person leaning towards something they wanted to forget. Through the gaps in the window, I could see the blurred ghosts of roadside objects, mailboxes, an abandoned sign, the sudden flash of a deer's reflective eye, and each time my heart gave a violent animal jump. People in the front kept yelling, but it wasn't direction. It was a flood. It all blended into noise. I remember the pressure behind my eyes building into a ringing. I remember thinking that at any moment the road could betray us, that the driver could hit a patch, and the car could spin or the trees could reach in and take us. The turns got sharper. The speed did not slow. The car skid slightly on gravel once. The sound was a ragged scrape, teeth on metal, and the car shuddered under us. I could feel the seatbelt pressing into my chest, but it seemed almost useless against the way the car dove and rose. My mouth tasted like pennies and cigarettes. My bones felt hollow. I thought about calling out to tell him to slow down, to tell him to pull over, to tell him to let someone else drive, but the words were lodged behind a dry, heavy thing in my throat, and the logic of the moment was a fragile glass ornament I dared not touch. We went off the asphalt once. The front bumper caught the edge of the road, and the car jutted sideways for a terrifying second. The trees loomed like a wall, and I felt a deep, stupid urge to unbuckle and run into them. That urge felt like everything in me had been split into two. One part, a mechanical animal waiting to react, the other a mind calculating the shape of a future in which I did not die. My body did not move. I clung to the seat with a kind of animal ferocity that surprised me. Each jolt felt like a small world ending. There was a moment, about 20 minutes in, when time changed. It stretched into something long and terrible, each second magnified and ringing loud like a bell. The road ahead seemed to fold away into a long, tight tunnel. The car's engine sounded like a beast breathing in a cave. Someone in the front made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob, but it was muffled by the car itself. The windows fogged over with breath so much that the outside became an impressionist painting. The driver's hands were too steady for someone who had been drinking, and that steadiness made it worse. It was like he had settled into intent, a terrible calm. We went over a bridge. Bridges in the dark are always scary, like the world loosens itself there. The metal framework flashed past in short electric slaps. I imagined us sliding over the side, a slow rolling motion that ended in the cold, terrible shock of water. I saw myself face down, mouth full of river taste, my lungs screaming and refusing to work. I saw the trees above us, the sky gone thin as paper. I tried to breathe slower, to tell my body to conserve air for when it mattered, which sounds ridiculous now, but thinking like that felt like a plan. Somewhere past the bridge, the car hit something soft and heavy, and the whole thing gave a sick, shearing lurch. The left tire went into mud or gravel, I couldn't tell. The car leaned in a way that made my stomach hitch like free-falling. We skidded sideways, then corrected, and the seat screamed under us. My world shrank until it was the hard edge of the back of the front seat, the two shoulders pressing into mine, the dark ribbon of the road outside. A sense of impending collapse pressed into me with the force of a physical thing. I thought about my parents, about the stupid little things they would tell me when I called them later, about all the small, trivial details of my life that seemed suddenly so precious in the face of this possible end. I cataloged them quickly, like a person trying to ensure they are remembered. People were shouting now for real, not just the drunken noise of trying to be brave. The driver's foot seemed to stamp the pedal like someone thrashing to keep a sinking boat afloat. The car answered, but the control was wrong. It was wobbling between smoothness and chaos like a machine about to fail. The headlight slid left and right across the trees, and the world outside was a speeded film that made my stomach lurch in new, terrible ways. I could smell burning, rubber maybe, or the sharp metallic tang of something rubbing where it shouldn't. My hands were numb from gripping. The seatbelt cut into me in a clean white line. Then for a heartbeat, everything slowed. The car went over a small ridge and, like the quiet before a storm, there was almost a silence where the normal sound of the world, the hum of the engine, the rustle of wind, dropped away and left only the breath in my ears. In that slice of silence, I thought I would die. I thought about the thin sliver of time after death, the way memory keeps replaying some details because that's what it knows how to do. I imagined whatever came next as something quiet and honest, not dramatic, just the end of the noise. It was a strange, terrible comfort to think the end might be plain and quick. We didn't die. The car found a road again, or the driver found whatever ragged skill remained sober in him, and he pulled the wheel with a kind of desperate concentration. We slowed, though I'm not sure by how much. Nothing about the ride became safe. It simply became only slightly less like the inside of a nightmare. The trees still pressed in like a living thing. The road still had too many turns. The car kept making small, terrifying decisions that could have been catastrophic. My jaw ached from clenching. My breath came in ragged pulls. I felt shaky in the way you feel after a fever breaks. Hours later, I think it had only been half an hour, but it felt like an eternity. We reached a house with a porch light on. The headlights lit up a cluster of cars in the porch, and the scene looked like a diorama of ordinary life. People tumbled out of the car like pieces from a broken puzzle. My legs wobbled under me. I remember the sudden, disorienting normalcy of being on a flat, solid porch, with the buzz of a light overhead, and the distant sound of a TV from inside the house. Someone patted my shoulder like that would fix anything. I remember the smell of other people's breath in the night air, which suddenly felt fresh, as if the dark had been rinsed out of it. The driver stumbled as he got out. He swayed in a way that told you how little he had cared for the lives in that car. Everyone dispersed like small, guilty animals. People laughed, and the laughter was a brittle thing. No one called the cops. No one demanded answers. No one mentioned pulling the car over. We had all, somehow, decided to let the danger finish its business quietly, and then pretend it hadn't nearly happened to us. I could feel rage hot in my chest, hot and stupid at all of it. At the driver, at my friends for letting him, at myself for not forcing the issue. But the anger was mixed with an odd, tremulous relief, and I clung to that relief like a raft. At the house, the lights in the kitchen were on. Someone offered me water. My hands shook so much that I almost spilled. My body felt raw, like when you scrape a knee and the skin is thin for a while afterward. I pressed my palms together and tried to steady myself. I tried to make sense of the math of what had almost occurred. The speed, the turns, the wildness, and how small mistakes can add up into the kind of thing that breaks bones and lives. I thought about how simple it would have been for a different bump to send us spinning into a tree or over a guardrail. I thought about the randomness of where a car can find its end and how fragile everything is. For a long time after, I carried the memory like a cracked jar. You can look inside and see what's left, but the whole shape has been changed. It colored my life in ways I did not want. I stopped getting into cars with people whose hands I did not trust. I started saying no more often. I stopped assuming the people around me would make the right choice. The fear settled into me like a small, steady stone. When I closed my eyes, I could still place the tilt of the seats, the smell of the upholstery, the echo of gravel under tires. Those images would come back without warning, in quiet moments in the middle of the day while making coffee. Sometimes it would be a flash. Sometimes it would drag, peeling layers of noise off until all that remained was the memory of that long, stretched second where I thought I would die. I owe my life to a series of dumb chances. I also owe it to the stubbornness of human luck that sometimes lets things slide by. We were lucky the road didn't end at the wrong angle. We were lucky a deer didn't sprint out at the worst moment. We were lucky the car didn't find a guardrail the wrong way. Luck is not a god or a promise. It is a ledger with no obligation. Remembering that night made me look differently at the things I could control. If there is good to be found in trauma, it is in the small decisions you can make after. To refuse to be silent about danger, to put safety before comfort, to voice the hard thing. The best part of the ending is simple and mundane and exactly what I needed. After nights of replaying it, after feelings that felt too big to name, after being hollowed out by fear in ways I never thought possible, I learned to let the memory settle into the past instead of letting it live in my every waking moment. I changed some habits. I stopped getting into cars with people who had been drinking, even if they begged and offered jokes. I let myself insist on calling a cab or sleeping on a couch. I told my roommate and a few people that I would not be a passenger for someone I did not trust. Those changes felt small, but they were acts of survival, and they made my world safer. It took time. I still flinch sometimes when a car pulls out in front of me, or when the road curves too fast. My hands still tighten on the steering wheel more than they used to, but the memories no longer toss me like a ship in a storm every night. They are the quiet marks on the inside of me, sharp at the edges when I notice them, but mostly dull the way old scars are. I learned to be kinder to my younger self, who sat in that back seat and thought the world might end. I learned that staying alive sometimes comes down to the same stubborn little things: refusing to get in, speaking up, walking away. I do not tell that story for thrill or shock. I tell it because it happened and because it changed me. The night in Weirton could have been the end of me, but it wasn't. The ending I have is full of ordinary things: small actions, new rules, and the slow rebuilding of trust in movement. I found my way back to normal not because the memory vanished, but because I made a new normal that kept me safe. That is enough. I grew up hearing pieces of this story my whole life, and even now, when I think about it, it leaves me uneasy in a way I can't quite explain. It didn't happen to me. It happened to my mother when she was a little girl in the late 1960s. By the time I came around, it was already a family story, one that had been repeated so many times that the details stuck with me, almost like I had been there myself. It has no tidy explanation, no strange twist, nothing you could really call supernatural, but it's the kind of thing that crawls under your skin because of what it leaves unsaid. My mom grew up in New Hampshire, though she was born in Virginia. Back then, my grandparents lived out in the country, not in town, but really out there, surrounded by fields, patches of woods, and long dirt roads that went on for miles. In the winter, it was the kind of place where the snow piled up until you couldn't see the fences anymore, where you had to shovel paths just to get from the front door to the barn. The woods seemed endless to a child, and even as an adult I can imagine how deep and quiet they must have felt in those winters. At the time this happened, my mom was about 4 years old. Her little brother, my uncle, was 3. My grandmother had her hands full with 2 small kids, especially in the dead of winter, when both of them had to be bundled up in layer after layer of clothes just to step outside. If you've ever dressed a kid that age for the snow, you know what it's like. The boots, the mittens, the hat, the scarf, the heavy coat, the snow pants. It's a whole ordeal. And kids don't make it easier. They wiggle, they complain, they take things off the second you turn your back. My mom was especially difficult with this. My grandmother would get her all ready to go outside, then turn her attention to my uncle. By the time she finished dressing him, she'd come back and find my mom had stripped everything off, left in just her indoor clothes again. It was infuriating. After it happened a few times, my grandmother decided she had to change her strategy. One morning, after bundling up my mom, she decided not to wait. Instead of leaving her inside, she opened the door, let the dog out, and set my mom on the porch while she got my uncle dressed. It was a safe enough idea, she figured. They lived in the middle of nowhere. No traffic, no neighbors close by. Just fields, woods, and the big yard. The dog would stay with her. And what trouble could a bundled-up 4-year-old really get into in a few minutes? But the thing about children is they wander. They don't see boundaries the way adults do. To my mom, the yard probably blended into the woods, and the woods looked inviting, all sparkling with snow. So while my grandmother was inside pulling mittens onto my uncle's hands, my mom just walked off. The dog followed her. That part has always stuck with me. The dog went with her into the trees, and at first there was no reason for anyone to worry. My grandmother assumed she'd be right outside the door when she came back. But when she opened it a few minutes later, arms full of my uncle, the porch was empty. At first it must have seemed like no big deal. Maybe she'd walked around the house. Maybe she was playing near the barn. My grandmother called her name. No answer. She walked farther out into the yard, scanning the snow. Still nothing. I don't think panic set in right away. At that age, kids could duck behind a tree or squat down in the snow and make themselves invisible. But then minutes stretched longer, and the dog wasn't there either. That's when my grandmother realized something was wrong. By the time my grandfather was told, the search had already begun. They called her name, they checked around the property, they walked up and down the road. The dog was nowhere in sight, and neither was my mom. After a little while, neighbors were called. The authorities were called. The kind of search that small communities organize without hesitation began almost immediately. From what I've been told, it became huge. Dozens of people combed through the woods. Dogs were brought in. They searched through fields, creeks, gullies. The dead of winter. A missing child was as serious as it gets. Exposure alone could kill in a matter of hours. The first night passed with no sign of her. The second night passed the same way. 2 days. By then they thought she was dead. The strange thing was the dog. At some point it returned on its own. Nobody knows when exactly, but it came back without her. That detail bothers me more than anything else. A loyal family dog, following a 4-year-old into the woods and then returning home without her. Why? Did it lose her? Did it leave her? Did it try to bring help in its own way? There's no way to know, but it must have added to the terror, because it meant she was truly out there alone. And yet, when they finally found her, she wasn't dead. She was discovered a couple of miles from home, at the bottom of a hill, just sitting there in the snow, covered in dirt, playing like nothing had happened. She wasn't crying. She wasn't frozen stiff. She was just there. The searchers had walked past that area before, they swore. They had swept through miles of woods calling her name. There had been dogs sniffing through the trees, men calling out, people scanning every dip and hollow. And yet for 2 days she had gone unseen. When they found her, she was missing much of the snow gear she had been wearing. Her mittens, her hat, pieces of her clothing gone. They were never recovered. She didn't remember what happened. That's the hardest part to swallow. At 4 years old, maybe memory doesn't stick the way it does for older kids, but still. 2 whole days, and she had nothing. No story, no explanation, just a gap. One moment she was on the porch, and then she was sitting in the snow at the bottom of that hill, a couple of miles away, as if the days between had been erased. The family was relieved, of course. Relieved beyond words, but underneath it there was always this gnawing unease. The search parties had been out there, combing every stretch of forest. They should have found her the first night. They should have seen her, or heard her, or tracked her. Yet she slipped through it all, somehow alive, somehow unharmed beyond the dirt and the missing clothes. When my grandmother told the story later, her voice always carried a kind of disbelief. Like she was grateful, yes, but also unsettled, because there was no way to tie it up neatly. She had lost her daughter to the woods, the dogs, the snow, and somehow gotten her back without explanation. My mom grew up never really knowing what happened in those 2 days. She doesn't remember being cold or scared, or even moving through the woods. She only remembers being found, sitting in the snow, playing like a child who had only just stepped outside. The snow clothes never turned up, not in spring when the thaw came, not in later years. They were simply gone, as if the forest had swallowed them whole. Whenever I picture it, I imagine the silence of those woods in winter, the way the snow muffles sound, the way bare trees stretch in every direction, how a small child could vanish between them without a trace. I imagine my mom sitting at the bottom of that hill, dirt smudged on her face, mittens missing, staring at the snow like it was just another day. And I imagine the moment she was spotted, the wave of voices, the rush of boots crunching through the snow, the disbelief of grown men seeing her there when she shouldn't have survived. There's no ghost in this story, no monster, no shadowy figure, just the woods, the snow, and a child who wandered off and was lost for 2 days. And that's what makes it worse. Because when there's no explanation, when memory gives you nothing, all you're left with is a blank space where something should be. The story never ends with answers. It ends the way it always has, with my grandmother shaking her head and saying how close they came to losing her, how lucky they were, and how to this day nobody understands where she went or why she survived when the odds were so slim. It's a story that belongs to my family, but it's also a story that belongs to the woods of New Hampshire, to that long winter, to the unanswerable silence that swallowed 2 days of a little girl's life, and gave her back as if nothing had happened. And the older I get, the more I realize that sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that don't explain themselves. They just leave you staring into the trees, wondering how easily the world can take someone, and how little it takes to keep them gone. I don't remember the exact year anymore. Somewhere in the late 80s, maybe early 90s. I was younger then, with more patience for late nights behind a motel desk. Huff's Motel sat right off the parkway, a squat row of pale brick rooms with buzzing neon signs, and a cracked parking lot that always seemed to smell faintly of oil and damp leaves. It wasn't a glamorous place, not even close, but it was steady. Travelers pulled off the parkway when they were too tired to keep driving. And sometimes you got truckers who just needed a bed for the night. I had grown used to the rhythm of it. Keys sliding across the counter, the dull thump of suitcases, car doors slamming, the faint laughter of people settling into their rooms. That night wasn't supposed to be any different. The lobby light hummed overhead. The soda machine outside rattled every time someone used it, and the air smelled like coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. I was behind the counter going through the logbook when the door pushed open. A man stepped in. He wasn't the kind of person who usually caught my attention. Average height, plain clothes, dark jacket, faded jeans, a baseball cap pulled low. His face looked tired, maybe road-worn, like he'd been traveling too long without much rest. He carried a bulky pack, the kind hikers used, with straps hanging loose and the faint smell of pine clinging to it, like he'd been out in the woods. He didn't say much. He didn't even look around the lobby like most people did when they first came in. He just asked if he could leave his gear there for a while. I assumed he meant what most people did, that he wanted to walk down the parkway, maybe get some food, stretch his legs, look around without dragging a heavy pack. It wasn't unusual. Huff's didn't get tourists in the same way downtown hotels did, but we got enough hikers or people who had been camping who didn't want to lug their stuff into restaurants. So I said sure. I pointed to a spot near the counter, and he set it down carefully, like there was something heavy or fragile inside. He gave me a quick nod and walked back out the door. That was it. No small talk, no booking a room, no details about where he was headed. Just gone. I remember sitting there afterward, glancing at the pack every so often. It was a dark color, maybe green or black, with straps looped tight across the middle. Nothing looked strange about it. I figured he'd be back soon. People usually were. The parkway had a few restaurants, a couple of souvenir shops, and some spots to sit and look at the mountains. I didn't think much of it. An hour went by. No sign of him. Then another. The pack just sat there, leaning against the counter like a forgotten pet. The lobby grew quieter as the night went on. Cars pulled in, headlights flashing across the windows, then died down again as people settled into their rooms. Every time the door opened, I half expected it to be him, stepping back inside, brushing off his jacket, ready to collect his gear and head out. But it never was. By midnight, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't just that he hadn't returned. It was how clean his exit had been. He hadn't asked how long he could leave it, hadn't given me a name, hadn't said when he'd be back. It was like he had dropped it off on purpose, not temporarily. The pack sat there all night. The next morning, when the day clerk came in, I explained. She frowned, stared at the bag, and asked if he'd left a note. I told her no. We debated whether we should open it, but in the end we didn't. People left strange things behind in motels all the time. Clothes, wallets, coolers, even a box of vinyl records once. Usually they came back for them, so we decided to give it some time. But the day passed. Then another. No one showed up. Eventually the manager got involved. He wasn't happy. He asked me every detail. What the man looked like, how old he seemed, what kind of accent he had. The truth was I didn't have much to give. He looked ordinary. American. Probably in his 30s or 40s, not too young, not too old. His voice was low, flat, with no strong accent I could place. The only thing I remembered clearly was how tired he looked, like his eyes carried weight that the rest of him didn't. The manager decided to call the police just to be safe. 2 officers came down and asked the same questions. They looked at the pack, handled it gently, and then asked if we were sure we wanted to open it. I remember feeling a pit in my stomach then, wondering what could possibly be inside. They opened it. I expected clothes, maybe camping gear, food wrappers, things hikers usually carried. There were some clothes, yes, folded neatly, and a few supplies, but also papers, documents, an old notebook, things that looked personal. The officers flipped through them, their brows tightening. They didn't tell us much, but I remember catching a glimpse of a driver's license tucked into a wallet. They had a name. They took the pack with them. For a few days, the motel buzzed with speculation. Guests who had overheard pieces of the story whispered about it in the hallways. Some thought he just skipped town, maybe left his old life behind. Others thought worse, that something had happened to him, that he never made it to wherever he was going after he left the lobby. I couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd walked out so calmly, like he had a clear plan, like leaving that pack there was intentional. Weeks passed. We heard little bits from the local news, though nothing concrete. The police had identified him, I was pretty sure of that. I don't remember the name now. It was common enough that it didn't stick in my head. What I do remember is that he was never seen again. Not there, not anywhere. The strangest part was how quickly the story faded. No missing posters around town, no news updates after a while. Just silence. Like he had been swallowed up by the parkway itself, erased the moment he stepped out of that door. I kept thinking back to that night, to the moment when he first walked in. If I had asked one more question, where he was headed, how long he'd be, maybe I would have known more. Maybe someone would have known where to look for him. Instead, all I had was a picture in my mind. A man with a tired face setting down his pack, walking out into the night and never returning. Even now, decades later, I find myself replaying it. The way the lobby smelled of burnt coffee, the hum of the light overhead, the soft scrape of the pack against the floor, his hand on the door pushing it open one last time, and then nothing. That's the part that lingers, not just that he disappeared, but how easy it was. How a man could walk into a small motel, leave behind everything he carried, and vanish so completely that no one, not even the police, could follow the trail. I tried to search years later to see if the case had ever been resolved, but nothing ever came up. It was as if the world itself had let go of him, and maybe that's what unsettles me most. Not the pack, not the unanswered questions, but the idea that someone could walk out the door right in front of me and be gone forever.